She found 2 helpless Bigfoot babies shivering and dying in the snow outside her cabin. She brought them inside and kept them safe through the night. But the next morning, something unbelievable happened. When she looked outside, a massive Bigfoot tribe surrounded her cabin in complete silence. What followed was an encounter unlike anything she had ever experienced. Abigail was 63 years old and lived alone in a small cabin set deep in the forest. Winters were always hard, but she was used to the silence, the heavy snow, and the cold that pressed against the windows. On this night, the storm was worse than usual. Snow hammered the roof, the wind pushed hard at the walls, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. She sat close to the fire, adding wood from the stack she kept beside the stove. The flames snapped and hissed, fighting back the chill that tried to creep inside. Abigail wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and listened to the storm. Nights like this usually brought nothing but wind and drifting snow, but something broke through the noise. At first, she thought it was just the wind shifting, but then she heard it again, faint cries that carried over the storm. It wasn't the call of a coyote, nor the low growl of a bear. The sound was high, thin, and desperate. Abigail stiffened, straining her ears. The cries came again, uneven and weak, almost like a child out in the cold. She rose from her chair and moved to the door. The storm howled as she cracked it open, icy air rushing inside. The cries were clearer now, just beyond the cabin in the snow. They were too human-like to ignore and too fragile to belong to anything that could survive long in the storm. Abigail knew she had to look. Abigail pulled the door wider and stepped onto the porch. The storm cut at her face, the snow so heavy it blurred the line between ground and air. She heard the sound again, closer now, thin and broken. She took a few steps forward, her boots sinking deep into the drift. Then she saw them. 2 small shapes huddled together at the edge of her cabin wall, half buried in snow. At first, she thought they were children, lost and left behind. But as she drew closer, her breath caught. These were not children. Their bodies were covered in thick, matted hair, their faces broad but soft, and their large dark eyes blinked at her with fear and exhaustion. They were young, no taller than 3 or 4 feet, and they trembled so hard their small shoulders shook under the weight of the storm. One gave a weak cry, and the other pressed closer, as if to shield it. Their limbs were thin, their movements slow, as if the cold had already drained the life out of them. Abigail froze where she stood. Every story she had ever heard about the creatures in the forest came to mind, tales of Bigfoot that most people dismissed as legend. Yet here they were, 2 of them, young and helpless at her feet. Her first instinct was fear. She looked into the dark trees, half expecting something larger to come crashing through. But the storm howled, and nothing moved beyond the snow. Abigail knew the creatures wouldn't last another hour in the cold. Whatever they were still alive, and they needed warmth. She pushed aside her fear, bent down, and lifted them one at a time. Their bodies were heavy with wet fur, their skin beneath icy cold to the touch. She carried them back inside, closed the door against the storm, and laid them near the fire. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. Abigail shut the door tight against the storm and set the latch. The 2 small creatures lay on her rug, their fur clumped with melting snow. They shivered so violently she feared they might not survive. She pulled 2 heavy wool blankets from her bed and wrapped them both, tucking the edges close to hold in the heat. They were slow to respond at first, their breathing ragged and weak. But once the fire's warmth reached them, they stirred, small hands clutching the fabric as if afraid it would be taken away. Abigail knelt beside them, studying their features under the flicker of firelight. Their faces carried both human and animal traits: broad brows, flat noses, and wide, dark eyes that reflected the flames. Their small mouths opened with faint whimpers, and their expressions showed fear mixed with trust. One reached toward her, its hand larger than a human child's, but with the same shape, 5 fingers, thick and strong. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The creature's grip tightened around her fingers, and she felt its trembling ease. The second soon leaned against her leg, clinging to her as though she were the only safe thing in the world. Abigail went to her cupboard and found a loaf of bread left from the day before. She tore it into small pieces, softened them with water, and offered the food. The infants sniffed, then slowly began to eat. Their movements were cautious, but hunger pushed them to accept. She gave them sips of water from a tin cup, which they drank with clumsy eagerness. Sitting by the fire, Abigail felt a weight settle in her chest. She had no children left of her own, no family nearby. Yet here were 2 helpless beings, depending on her as if she were their mother. Against all reason, she felt protective of them. Morning light crept through the cracks in the shutters. The storm had eased, leaving the world outside silent and buried under snow. Abigail moved quietly so as not to wake the 2 infants still bundled near the fire. Their small chests rose and fell steadily, proof they had survived the night. She set a kettle on the stove and sliced what little bread she had left for her own breakfast. The fire popped, and for a moment the cabin felt almost ordinary again. But then something shifted outside. A sound not the storm, not the creak of ice caught her attention. Abigail walked to the frosted window and brushed away the thin layer of ice with her sleeve. What she saw made her body freeze. Shadows moved among the trees. At first, she thought they were tricks of the light, but the shapes grew clearer. They were tall, towering. Her eyes widened as she counted them. Not 2, not 10, but dozens. The clearing around her cabin was filled with massive figures, standing silent in the snow. Dark fur covered their broad shoulders, and steam rose from their breaths in the morning cold. Abigail's hands trembled on the windowsill. She counted quickly 20, 30, maybe more. Every one of them faced the cabin, unmoving, watchful. Their presence was heavy, their silence louder than the storm had ever been. Her first thought was of the infants still wrapped by the fire. They were not lost after all. They belonged to these beings. And now their kin had come. Abigail stepped back from the window, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. The cabin no longer felt safe. The babies were not alone, and neither was she. Abigail stood frozen at the window, her breath clouding the glass. The shapes outside did not move, but their presence pressed against her cabin like a weight. She knew she couldn't hide. The 2 infants by the fire belonged to them. If she stayed inside, fear would consume her. She straightened her shoulders, pulled her shawl tight, and walked to the door. Her hand lingered on the latch. For a moment, she thought of barring it, pretending the world outside did not exist. But the silence was too heavy, the waiting too long. With a steady breath, she lifted the latch and eased the door open. The cold hit her first. Then came the sight. One of the giants stepped forward from the group. He was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway if he tried. His fur was dark, thick with frost, and his face carried lines of age and authority. He stopped a few paces from the porch and locked eyes with her. Abigail knew at once this was the leader. Behind him, the tribe stood in perfect stillness. Every gaze was fixed on her cabin, on what lay inside. The air was heavy with expectation. Abigail gripped the doorframe to steady herself. Fear ran through her, sharp and cold, but she forced her hands to stay visible and empty. She made no move to threaten, no move to retreat. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. The leader did not growl or advance. He only watched her, his dark eyes flicking past her shoulder toward the firelight where the infants rested. His meaning was clear. Abigail swallowed hard. She understood. They knew their young were inside, and now they wanted them back. Abigail turned from the door and looked back at the fire. The two infants were awake now, their dark eyes following her every move. They made soft, whimpering sounds, as if they too sensed what waited outside. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to move. She bent down, lifted one small body into her arms, then the other. Their fur was warm now, their weight solid against her chest. The moment she held them, they clung to her, gripping her shawl with surprising strength. Step by step, Abigail carried them to the doorway. The cold air rushed in as she pushed the door open wider. The tribe stirred. Dozens of heads turned, and the leader stepped forward again, towering in the snow. The reaction was instant. The babies wriggled in her arms, stretching their hands toward the group. Small cries filled the air, sharper than the storm had ever been. The tribe responded with low murmurs, deep sounds that vibrated through the clearing. Abigail's heart pounded, but she stayed steady. She looked at the leader. His eyes met hers, dark, steady, unreadable yet not cruel. In that silent moment, she felt his message. He knew she had sheltered them. He knew she had chosen compassion over fear. The leader took one slow step closer, then stopped. He did not reach for the infants, not yet. He simply stood, his gaze fixed on Abigail, and then it passed between them an unspoken understanding. Abigail had protected what mattered most. The leader lifted one massive hand and gave a slow, deliberate signal. The tribe stirred but did not rush forward. Instead, two smaller adults stepped out from the group and approached the cabin with careful movements. Their size dwarfed Abigail, but their steps were measured, respectful. The infants squirmed harder in her arms, reaching for them. Abigail bent down and released the young ones into the snow at her feet. The two adults crouched low, gathering the little ones gently against their chests. The cries stopped almost at once. The babies pressed close to them, safe again with their own kind. Abigail stayed in the doorway, gripping the frame for balance. She expected anger, or perhaps a warning, but none came. The tribe stood in silence, their great bodies still against the white of the snow. The leader's gaze never left her. There was no hostility in it, only acknowledgement. One of the adults carrying the infants gave a deep rumble, almost like a note of thanks. The sound carried through the clearing, low and steady. Abigail didn't know what it meant, but she felt it was not meant as a threat. Then another figure, tall and broad, stepped forward from the group. It carried something in its hand, a small branch, smoothed at the ends. The creature bent and laid it carefully on the snow near her door. When it straightened, it gave one slow nod before stepping back into line. No words were spoken. No growls were raised. With the infants secure, the leader turned, and the tribe moved as one. Their huge forms faded into the trees, their steps so controlled they left only faint impressions in the snow. Within moments, the clearing was empty again. Only the token remained at Abigail's door. The clearing was silent once more. The great shapes had vanished into the forest as if they had never been there. Only the snow remained, marked faintly by tracks already beginning to fill with drifting flakes. Abigail stood in her doorway, staring into the trees, half expecting them to return. But the woods held their silence. She looked down at the object left behind. The small branch lay where the creature had placed it, smooth and deliberate, unlike any fallen twig. Abigail bent slowly, picked it up, and held it in her hands. It was nothing ordinary. It was a sign. A message she couldn't fully understand, but she knew it had meaning. She carried it inside and set it carefully on the mantel above the fire. The cabin felt quiet again, the only sound the crackle of wood and the soft whistle of wind against the window. Yet the stillness was different now. Abigail sat in her chair, staring at the flames. She was shaken, but beneath that, something else filled her heart. She had been trusted, if only for a night. Trusted to protect the most precious lives of a hidden people. It was a night she would never forget.